Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for NKU's Ethics and Society Lecture Series, the first of Ethics and Lecture Series. My name is Robert Bryce, and on behalf of the philosophy program, I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion, The Future of Humanity in an AI-Dominated World. Now, before we begin, a few things. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the Dean's Office in the College of Arts and Sciences. Yes, thank you. Yep. Thank you to the College of Arts and Sciences for supporting this event. Our Dean, Bethany Bowling, has been a wonderful, reliable, vocal advocate for creating space for conversations just like this. And we're very happy for her support and, of course, for her leadership. So I'd like to take a moment and hand it over to our Dean, Bethany Bowling.
Thank you so much, Robert. I don't want to say too much, but I do want to say that the college is extremely grateful to Robert and the students, Ren and Alador. We're thrilled to support you to make this happen and to have what I think is a very meaningful conversation. For those of you that know me, you know that I'm a biologist, and you probably know that I'm a glass half full kind of person. I think that one of the benefits that perhaps we are seeing from AI, the rise of artificial intelligence, is increased conversation and interest in humanity and the humanities as fields of study. I think as a biologist, I've thought often about what it means to be human. I probably have not spent, even though I consume lots of products of humanity work and art and literature and various things like that, I probably haven't thought a lot about what it means to be human from a philosophical perspective. And so I am really grateful that we're having this conversation today, and I think that there are more conversations to be had and more critical thinking around what it means to be human and what it means for humanity. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Robert, and thank you all for joining us today. We so appreciate it, and we're thrilled that you're here.
Well, before we begin our panel discussion, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the winners of our student competition. The competition asked students to think critically and creatively about the impact of AI on themselves, on humanity. So they were asked to submit papers, they were asked to submit artistic creations, scientific posters. So first I'd like to recognize and congratulate our runner-up, Samuel Dethridge, for his paper on the moral, social, and environmental impacts of AI. Samuel, if you're here, please step forward and collect your award. Come on down. I think we got a picture here. So.
You want to shake hands?
Sure, we can shake hands, of course. Sure. There you go.
Thank you.
Congratulations. And, sure, yeah. And please help me in congratulating our winner, BFA acting major Tristan Pianowski, for his fictional account of a future society with an all-knowing AI as its leader. Tristan, if you're here, please step forward and receive your award. Come on down, Tristan. Yeah, good to meet you. There we are. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Okay, we are fortunate to have an outstanding group of panelists joining us today. I'd like to take a moment to introduce each of them. Dr. Claire Batty is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky. Her research focuses on the philosophy of perception, particularly questions that arise from investigating the non-visual modalities. She also serves as director of the cognitive science minor. Dr. Andre Curtis Trudell is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati. His primary interests include the philosophy of science, philosophy of artificial intelligence. He also serves as the director of the Center of Humanities and Technology there at UC. Dr. Guy Dove is a professor of philosophy at the University of Louisville. One of his primary research interests include the role language plays in cognition. He is a Bingham Faculty Fellow in the Commonwealth Center for Humanities and Society. Dr. Peter Fossel is a professor of philosophy at Transylvania University. He serves as the director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, the PPE program there. He specializes in the philosophy of David Hume and is interested in AI's impact on the teaching of liberal arts, in particular, the humanities. Dr. Michael Hicks is an associate professor of philosophy at Miami University of Ohio. His interests include the philosophy of mind, language, and the history of analytic philosophy. He's concerned about the way AI technology threatens to distort our ability to recognize one another. And Dr. Kate Johnson is an associate professor of philosophy at Bellarmine University. Her research interests focus on moral theory, applied ethics, and the philosophy of hope, which I think we can all appreciate. She also serves as the University Director of the Ethics and Social Justice Center. So thank you all for being here and for contributing your time and, of course, your expertise to this important topic. So for many years, artificial intelligence has been seen as science fiction, right, as a far off, a distant, speculative technology, but that's no longer the case. AI is here. It is reshaping the way that we think, the way that we talk, the way that we work. And I think it's also raising fundamental questions about our understanding of personhood. It's also raising questions about our understanding of consciousness. It's raising questions about our understanding of moral responsibility. So today's discussion brings together perspectives to explore what it means for us as individuals, for us as an institution, for us as members of a society. Now, although our topic at times, I think, can seem somewhat stressful, I'm hoping that today's topic will be just conversational, hoping that it will be stress-free. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time asking them some questions that we've discussed beforehand. But then I'm going to spend some time turning it over to you guys, right? So I'll spend maybe 15 to 20 minutes with audience questions. All right, sound good? Okay. All right, so let's begin with some foundational questions. I thought we would start with this. What, if anything, distinguishes human intelligence from artificial intelligence? And does this distinction matter for our future? And this is, anybody can start here. Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
The way I see the distinction between human and artificial intelligence is that human intelligence has consequences, and in a way that is much more tangible than the consequences that artificial intelligence would experience by itself in a digital realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, we have to share mics, so go ahead. Guy? Yeah.
I think we can talk about differences in a number of profound ways having to do with cognitive architecture. So in some ways, contemporary forms of AI, particularly large language models, know too much. Right? They know everything that's available on the internet. And part of the revolution is an old technology that has been enhanced by just reams of data. And then they also know too little. So one of the key differences between large language models and human cognition is that there's no autobiographical memory, there's no personality. They've been described as agent smoothies because they adopt the personality of the data that is available to them on any particular task and then switch immediately. There's no emotionality or consistency. Turn the mic's on. Oh. Yeah, the mic's not on. Okay, is that better? So no autobiographical memory, no emotions, no coherence. And so even though they perform well on benchmarks, there are some profound differences with regard to cognitive architecture when compared to human beings.
Can you hear me? Yes, you can. I can hear myself. In fact, I've been talking about this with my students just recently. This is sort of where we're ending my philosophy of cognitive science class. And I don't know anything about the sort of backside of any of these models, but I think apart from answering what distinguishes human intelligence from artificial intelligence, one of the things we have to think about, and one of the things that they've brought up and thought a lot about, and kind of fall on one side is consciousness. And so you brought up some of the emotions and the notion of experiential continuity and so on and so forth. And largely at this point, they think, I mean, I don't know what I think at this point. They think that what's the difference between them and say when they chat with ChatGPT is that they have this kind of awareness and this kind of consciousness. So that has to be taken into account no matter where you land in sort of disambiguating this question, I think.
Is this thing on? Yeah.
It's on, sorry.
So I think like one thing that is sort of useful to keep in mind when we're thinking about artificial intelligence, especially in the context of like large language models specifically, is that these are products developed by companies. And those companies have particular sorts of goals and interests in developing these products. So, large language models like ChatGPT or Claude are sort of designed by these companies to be the 3 H's. This is what they're sometimes called: helpful, harmless, and there's a third H. I can't remember it. But there's a third H, but they're supposed to be sort of helpful to you as a user. And so it's very easy to sort of read like mentality and cognition into them because they've been designed to be this way. And so there's still a sort of additional question, given the kind of thing that they are, the way that they're trained, I think it's sort of important to bear that in mind when we're thinking about whether these things do have cognition in some sense or intelligence, or whether it's just sort of a facsimile, whether they're parroting sort of human cognition.
Is this on? Oh my gosh. That really is on. So, I mean, I think one of the first questions we should ask, though, is what's intelligence? If you're going to ask, what's the difference in intelligence, you should probably start by asking about what's intelligence. It's not my expertise, and so I know psychologists and cognitive scientists are going to have a lot to add to this, but we just stay at the outset that if there's artificial intelligence and human intelligence, they ought to, in some sense, be similar or have something in common. Otherwise, why apply the term intelligence to both? I would affirm, too, what my colleague Kate said, that and Claire said, that we've got to distinguish between intelligence and consciousness. I think all kinds of systems can be intelligent but not conscious. I think trees are probably intelligent but not conscious. I think computers can be intelligent but not conscious. I think, yeah, I mean, and what would be intelligence in that sense? One thing I think would be we would want to relate it to some kind of problem solving or sequential determination of relationships among concepts or terms. So if you're doing logical relationships or psychological relationships or categorical relationships of various kinds, I think that can be done. And if you think about problems like a tree has and how to move water from its roots to its leaves, that sort of problem can be understood as I think. You could even speak of, I think, the intelligence of ecosystem. But what human intelligence is going to be, I think, is going to be related to human existence and human life in a way that it will never be for computers or let's just say, non-sentient, non-biological forms of intelligence. And it's that embeddedness of intelligence in what I think in the liberal arts we try to enrich and understand and develop, and that is our humanness. And so to the extent that intelligence is embedded in human life, human existence, and all that goes with that, and human consciousness, too, I would say. I have my doubts that any computers are conscious, but those would be but as intelligence is probably similar, but in the way it functions, it would be very different because for humans, it's embedded in human life.
I guess I should
Yeah.
talk too. So if I'm making weird faces, it's because I'm right in front of the lights. It's not that I'm angry at or anything. Anyway,
Adjust that, or?
I'm tempted to say, in reaction to what all of my colleagues have been saying, that it's important also to sort of invert these two questions that we're looking at here, because when we ask what is the difference between these two things, I mean, there's lots and lots of differences, and there's also lots of similarities depending on what matters, depending on what you're worried about, depending on what you're caring about. And so for certain purposes, like if we want somebody to efficiently produce calculations, then artificial versions of that might be more effective than human versions of it, in which case, I mean, not with current LLMs, but previously, in the previous generation of artificial intelligence, namely digital computers, it was clear why we would worry about a difference between human and artificial calculation. But when we're worried about questions of human flourishing, then the differences are going to be different. The distinctions we want to draw are different. So I think it's important whenever you're taking up this kind of question, and I'm sure that each of my colleagues could tell you what mattered to them in the way they answered the question, but it's important for you also, whenever you're taking up this question, to remind yourself that drawing a distinction is always easy, and asking yourself, why do I care about that distinction? What matters here in drawing this distinction is the hard work. That's all I've got to say on that.
Yeah. No, good. Anyone else? Yeah, Guy, please.
All right, you can hear me now? Okay, good. I think we have to be careful of two things, particularly in drawing the comparison. So the one is just anthropomorphizing, right? We can think of its behavior on benchmarks that we've created and be really impressed by it and then think that they might be human in some sense. And indeed, this is a problem with interacting with AI that we've really come across. I also think we need to be worried about anthro-fabulation, which is this term that Cameron Buckner made up. And that's where we think of ourselves as having some sort of magical quality, maybe in consciousness, and then try to distinguish ourselves from AI. So I'm in this weird position where I'm worried about the effect of AI on the world, but I'm also, theoretically, it's another tool for understanding how human cognition works. And so sort of using it as a kind of mirror of us, it's a model, right? But we need to be very careful about what it's modeling, how it's modeling, and that's something we need to think through, and we need to be very attentive, because we can be fooled into talking to Claude, to thinking it's human, and we can also be fooled into thinking, well, it just doesn't lack, embodiment or some sort of magical quality, and then we can misinterpret its possible effect on the world.
I mean, those are the first things you said about, being careful about talking about this is, I mean, I'm just going with what's happened this week in my class is sort of trying to think about, like, are we assuming that we're special in some kind of way? And of course, many people think, they or we are special in this sense, and that to really figure out the answer to this question, you have to look inward in that way and think about, are we any different and in what ways? And I like how you sort of flipped it as well to use it as a tool to have others think about, how we might work, which is also a kind of thing that I've been doing with my classes as well. Yeah. I'm not sure I understand why distinctions are really easy to make, but
Well, I mean, like,
I like chucking one out.
Yeah,
I see what you mean. Yeah. And then, okay.
there are also hard distinctions. There are lots of easy
gotcha,
ones.
I
That's all
gotcha.
I was saying.
All right, good. Well, let's move on to our next question. Does AI genuinely understand language, or is it merely simulating understanding? And why does this distinction matter? Any one of our panel want to take up that question? I think this was actually one of the questions that you guys put. Yeah, okay.
Responsible for that, so I should keep the ball rolling.
You're
since my
responsible for this
colleagues
question.
Look dumbfounded. I think this is really important. So, like, in that comparison between how, say, chatbots work and how we work, I think one of the fundamentally interesting questions that's arisen is how important is language to intelligence, right? So, again, we have benchmarks. We find that these large language models can do amazing things and go beyond computational models that we used using symbolic AI. And one of the questions that leads to is, well, why are large language models so successful? And what is it special about language? And I think one of the ways we fool ourselves, we think of ourselves as individual thinkers, and we don't realize the amount we rely on language to gain access to cultural information. And I think that's what a lot of these technologies are leveraging. And now on the normative side of things, like the ethical questions, like, well, they're leveraging it. They're leveraging something that humans have leveraged, but now they're doing it in a way that, is scraping it all up from the internet, and we need to be worried about, how that works. But I do think one of the things that we can find out is that actually language is really important to our intelligence along certain dimensions, and LLMs can show us that.
That's interesting. Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out the right distance. Oh, is it better? Oh, okay. I thought. Oh, I see. Thank you.
Me too.
Because this is like wiping me out. I can't hear myself when I can hear it through. Okay, good. All right. I thought maybe I was shouting to you. Okay. All right. What I was going to say was I liked. So one of the things I was tempted to say to the previous question was, the question was, is artificial intelligence and human intelligence the same? Or what distinction is there between them? And I wanted to say, but I bit my tongue because it's a philosopher's move, that we have to be careful about whether we put the emphasis on artificial or on intelligence. So whether it's fake intelligence or whether it's artificial intelligence. And if we take for granted that it's artificial intelligence, then we're going to set up the question in one way. And one of the things I liked about what you just said, one way of interpreting it anyway, is that we are much more taken in by, we're more easily faked out by a system that is better informed about our language practices, and that's a lot harder for us to see through. And so one way of getting at this would precisely be to say that this is why people are freaking out about these, is because they're harder to see through because of the way they're trained, rather than we are really dealing with genuine understanding of a sort that needs to change our paradigm of what linguistic training looks like. I'm not sure if that was what you were saying, but that's what I heard.
All right, I'm going to try one third time here. Okay, I think I'm better now. Okay. I think it's actually, they kind of bleed into each other. So I think one thing we can learn from LLMs is how much we rely on language, which I think goes away from a kind of way we think of ourselves. We think of ourselves as independent, individual cognizers, and we don't realize how much we depend on language.
Okay, well, I like that, yeah.
And show that language practices are actually fundamental to intelligence, but it can also show that there are other aspects of our existence that require intelligence, that, like the jaggedness of AI, right, that is really good for some things and not so good for other things. And that may have everything to do with the role that language plays in our cognitive lives. And so it's useful for that. But so it's both things. We can get fooled because it's really good at language, and we can talk to it, and it doesn't have what I mentioned earlier, which nobody heard, that it doesn't have a personality, it doesn't have autobiographical memory, it doesn't have a kind of coherent perspective on the world, and it doesn't have a reliable perception. And so all of those things aren't there, but we can get fooled into thinking it because of our language practices.
So I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. So I'm a philosopher of science by training, and so one of the interesting things I think that this question raises for me is, like, modulo some account of what language understanding is. I have no idea. I'll let the philosophers of mind handle that. But whatever that comes out to, how can we sort of measure it in a system, whether it's an LLM or a human or something else? And so, like, there's some interesting results on the technical side sort of coming out these days, which indicate, on the one hand, these LLMs are very good at sort of matching kind of success cases in human performance in like linguistics, sort of like reasoning tasks and things like that. But they also fail in ways that humans tend not to fail. And so thinking about how to sort of make sense of these kinds of divergences between LLM performance on the one hand, both success and failures, but then also human successes and failures is, I think, interesting here. And I think it also sort of goes back to this question of like, what do you want these models to do? One thing you might want them to do is like model human cognition, in which case maybe it sort of matters that they don't track human failure cases. But another thing that some people developing these models want them to do is like, they're not necessarily supposed to be models of human cognition. These are tools for like, being super intelligent or achieving super intelligence. And there it seems to me things are much less settled, and like, what is the right notion of like linguistic or language understanding if that's the goal of one of these models? I really don't know, but that strikes me as sort of like a really interesting philosophical question.
Go ahead.
I don't want to spend too much time, so I just wanted to say no, and it matters because because understanding is central to what it is to be a human being and to lead a meaningful human life. Although the word understanding is super vague, and we really need to parse that for a long time here. But that would be my short answer to it. Although I will emphasize too that I don't know either, because I have no idea how brains can think. I don't think anybody does, frankly. So there's a lot of magic and mystery going on in human life, and I think. But on the surface of it, from what I've seen so far, it's just clearly simulation, and a very powerful one, but it's still a simulation.
Yeah, Claire.
And I think it also matters, just pushing it back to sort of the subject, interacting with AI. And I mean, it might not matter in a particular case for an individual interacting with AI, whether or not it's mere simulation or whether or not it's genuine understanding. I mean, there are a lot of people that go on to ChatGPT to do therapy with it. And worries about that aside, which there are worries, sort of ethical concerns about that, I think there's questions about the self and relating to, well, the world, which is something I think about a lot when I think about perception, but also just, whether the subject cares or not, whether this is sort of a valuable thing for humans to be doing, like for flourishing or whatever these things mean. These are the kinds of questions I think it raises, and those questions definitely matter. And so when I think about is it sort of understanding or merely simulating? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I want to say it's merely merely simulating, understanding, but I very quickly think about these deeper questions about the self and about appearance and reality, and because if it's just merely simulating understanding, you might sort of get what you want from it in those kind of interactions. And maybe some of the things that it'll say will be helpful. But is that the sort of the best way? Is that the way we ought to be doing it? So we get into these normative kind of considerations with this question, I think.
There's just a little point there that I think would be helpful to clarify. There's a difference between whether AI genuinely understands language, which when I try to think about that question carefully, I ask who would be the understander in this situation? And a related question, which is whether the strings it produces are meaningful.
Yeah.
And to the extent that they might be meaningful to someone, then we have to ask deeper questions about whether there's anything more to something being meaningful than it's being in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
And so we might be willing to say that the AI is meaningful, even if we share a skepticism about whether it would make sense to describe the AI as genuinely cognizing or genuinely understanding.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point. If I could just jump back in, this maybe if you want to go on to another question, that's fine.
We'll move on right after yours. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, let me just say that I'm glad you brought up therapy, because one of the things I'm concerned about the main thing is my issue is AI as it'll function in liberal arts colleges for obvious reasons. But on a broader level, there are many other things to worry about. And one of them is the way people are using it for things like therapy, for companions. I've had arguments with people about using it in judicial contexts, all of which I'm deeply against. And I think that's something we really should talk about later. I think it's a profound assault on our humanness to pursue the AI in those contexts. And yeah, I hope we can discuss that in greater depth then.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and move to the human implications. How might AI reshape our understanding of ourselves? That is, the human self, our meaning, our purpose, our identity. Anyone care to weigh in on this?
I mean, I think about this question a lot, just generally, but I think about this question a lot in terms of my teaching, because one of the ways that I have remodeled one of my classes, so this of course is talking about AI with respect to teaching as well, to sort of bypass use of ChatGPT to generate stuff, is that I've started teaching a sort of intro to philosophy via questions about the self. And so I get them talking about themselves a lot, and it's great. It works out really well, and we sort of hit various topics along the way, personal identity, and so on and so forth. And I was thinking about this question, or a variance thereof, sort of last night, kind of prepping for this in my head, and thinking about how much, and I'm also a philosopher of perception, right? So experiences, those are good. And accurate ones are really good too. And so I was comparing this sort of questions about the self and this kind of narrative identity of the self, where your self is constructed by you out of various experiences. And we discuss that in my 100 class, but then I think about my other classes that I'm teaching where everyone, including me some days, is buried deep in their phone for the first 10 minutes before class, and it's a lot of TikTok and it's a lot of stuff. And I do think about this narrative view of how we construct ourselves, what further things we can say. I mean, I'm nothing normative here. What further things we can add to that, given that we are interacting with potentially misleading or just with not the physical world, in that way. And those experiences that we're having are being generated by, these images on the phone. And so I think about, whether or not that will harm that kind of narrative self-conception or meaning or purpose, and that's just to sort of chuck something out there. But it's something that I think about it and I think could have an impact on how we start to think about the self and the self's relation to the world. I think about that in terms of perception a lot, but I now have been thinking about it more deeply in terms of this, which of course involves perception, sound, and vision, but it's mediated.
Hello. So my framework for thinking about this question is through ethics. So I teach ethics all the time, and that's how I translate these types of questions. So in terms of how might AI reshape our understanding of ourselves, I think I interpret that question as how might AI, in what way, what role is it going to play in how we engage in the process of becoming who we are, right, as a moral being. And I think about this in terms of meaning in life and living well and human flourishing. And I have a 10-year-old, and quite frequently I think, well, I grew up without AI, and now he is growing up with AI. What role will AI play in how he becomes himself and the values and the moral beliefs that he embraces that reflect who he is? And, I think there are a lot of benefits to AI, but I don't yet understand how what kind of role it can play in this deeply important process of transformation in becoming our actually true selves. Hope that made sense.
One thing that I sort of think about in the context of this, and your sort of what you just said sort of helped crystallize this for me, but like we talk about de-skilling a lot in the context of AI, that if you like offload sort of the stuff that you ought to be doing yourself, whether it's writing or critical thinking or whatever, you'll get worse at it. And you might not sort of recognize that you're getting worse at it. And sort of one of the visions that is like kind of pitched for AI is that it can like help you get better at things. It's not gonna sort of gonna help you upskill as opposed to de-skill. And I guess in this context in particular, when we're thinking about like young folks who are sort of constantly interacting with AI, it's just sort of it's like endogenous, their sort of, you know, digital ecosystem. Are we gonna see a sort of like moral de-skilling that happens from folks if we increasingly treat these things as like, say, therapists or as guides or friends? So the sort of moral instruction like the, you know, that we get from other people is now being offloaded to AI systems maybe, and what are the sort of ramifications there? I don't know, but it worries me.
One of the things I worry about is the sort of epistemic consequence, right? Because the way these things are designed is to create plausible answers, right? And all they do is play the game of Chat GPT, if you want to think about it that way, which is to create the next plausible word. And so they're designed as products to do this, and I worry about how interacting with them can lead to problems in being able to understand how to get correct feedback from the world. So an example is writing an undergraduate paper, right? It's really good at handling a prompt that other people have written papers on before. And you can get a really pretty good paper from a prompt from Claude or ChatGPT. If you tell it to do something which really isn't a good idea, so I've found this on some philosophy questions, it'll do a terrible job. It'll do a great job at what it's designed to do, which is to create something that sounds plausible, right? But the plausibility will not be there because it's been tasked with doing something, say, putting two ideas together that don't belong together. And so the problem is it produces this product. It seems like it's plausible. It's designed to do it. That's what its job is. And the problem is then the student thinks that this thing that's been produced that is actually slop, right, is a good thing because it has all the features that would make it seem like a good thing, and it's been designed to do that. So it's been designed to fool us, and we need to be really careful in how we use it. And this is something I've seen with my students, right? It's not just, that, like, even when I'm saying, okay, you can use this, tell me what you did, tell me how you prompted it, and then here's how it went horribly wrong. And I think this is something that could happen in our lives, right? And, you know, God forbid, in therapy.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting, important question, and the comments have all been really important about this. I might say, like, how it's going to reshape ourselves. The way I sort of think about this is that, look, technologies have always shaped ourselves, and there have always been positive and negatives to that. And the question before us is this more you know, we haven't done much of it yet, so we don't know, but does its prospect look positive or negative to us? So when you think about something like writing, I would say was an invention that changed the human mind, I'm quite sure. And many of us think that for the good, that it expanded the human consciousness, communication, reasoning, inquiry, et cetera, culture. On the other hand, I mean, there's some evidence to suggest that the movement from oral culture to written culture lost certain things, or from even alphabets that are more abstract like ours to pictograms and hieroglyphics and that sort of thing, that our consciousness changed along with the way we expressed ourselves. And what we lost in sensuous ways of engaging the world, maybe we gained through abstract things. The printing press is another one. It made writing and reading much more available to people, and I think many of us think of that as positive. And I have a harder time thinking about the downsides of it, but I will say about, say, the internet. We're now at a stage, it's a really interesting moment, where we're now realizing, and I'm somebody who raised 2 children over the past 30 years, and 40. I I think, I've made some mistakes in allowing them too much time on computers in front of screens. What a mistake we made bringing iPads into classrooms. How much have children been damaged by all kinds of, filth and nonsense on the internet. I mean, we're starting to see the negative implications of that. My own sense is that this is going to be largely negative too. It'll have positive uses in industry and in medicine and things like that. But in terms of human moral life and human psychological life and human social life and political life, there's, I think, profoundly negative prospects to it. The quick thing to say about therapy is it's impossible for a computer to be a therapist for you. It's not another human being. It can give you a simulation of it. But and lonely people too. Obviously, the solution to loneliness is to have more human connection, not this AirSat pseudo connection that a screen is going to give you. We know that it's rubbish. So why is it being pushed on us so hard is, I think, a question we need to ask right now. But my own sense is this is not like the printing press. This is probably more like the dark web or the downsides of the web. And we have to be very, very careful with how we use it because it will affect ourselves in deep ways.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I think it's important to note that in some cases, and I mean, I've talked to people that there are some people that would rather do therapy with a chatbot than do it in person, because then they don't have to say all those things to an actual person. And so I have a friend who's a philosopher of psychology, and she says in many cases veterans, she's worked with vet communities, would rather, just sort of with a lot of PTSD and trauma, would rather sort of say these things out loud to a chatbot before, and maybe, leading up to having therapy with a three-dimensional sort of human. And so I just wanted to flag that. And also, going back to, Guy, what you were saying, somebody once said to me, ChatGPT, and I think this nicely sums it up, gives the appearance of an answer, right? It doesn't give an answer. It strings some things together. And that's the epistemic worry, which would also, is a worry about the therapy context as well, that you lack that connection, you lack that sort of, well, I mean, it connects up with all the things we've been saying so far, but you lack that personal sort of connection with another person. And the worry is also that, you're not really getting an answer and that it's not as valuable. Now, that's the other side of the coin to people say, well, I would rather go and talk to a chatbot before I would rather talk to a human, right? That's
well, I think the way you could, I know very little about the therapeutic context, so I'm way out beyond my, but you can think of the response there as being somebody who says, I want to work this out on my own, but I can't work it out just on my own. And so if they can see the chatbot therapist as not another person at all, and so but if there's an essential dimension, and this is where I don't know enough about the therapeutic context to be able to say, if there's an essential dimension to the intersubjectivity of it, then absolutely that something has gone wrong there. But if there isn't an essentially intersubjective dimension to all therapeutic contexts, and I certainly know that some therapists talk about letting it being the subject's job to work it out, and there are those jokes about the therapist who just nods along while you work it out on the couch, and I don't know how serious to take those jokes, and so I
actually accept that response. I think the quick thing I'd say is that the analogy I draw is that there's a place maybe in the world for people for online sex, for pornography, for sex work, but if you think that's going to substitute for real human sexuality, I think you're mistaken.
Right. So there's another philosopher in the world named Michael Hicks who wrote an essay, and I've sometimes worried that I got invited here because of his essay that he wrote. But he used, and so I'm going to begin with citations because I'm not sure how much trouble I'm going to get in for telling you the title of his paper. He used a technical term that Harry Frankfurt introduced in the late 80s to describe exactly this phenomenon. And the title of his paper was ChatGPT is bullshit. And that's exactly what, so bullshit is the technical term for, it's not lying, because lying, it matters that what you're saying you don't think is true, because the complicated moral context. A bullshitter is somebody who doesn't care about whether what they say is true. And what ChatGPT, the epistemic worry is exactly that the production is to satisfy the conversation, not with any concern about truth.
I'm going to just push back a little bit
Well, I
because
thought that was what you were saying.
because I think that humans bullshit too.
Oh, of course.
But I mean, I actually think it's an insight into how we think.
That might be.
So, I mean, it's so easy. This is the anthrophabulation problem, because we think of ourselves as pure reasoners when we are so often dependent on ideas that we've gotten from other sources. We often rely on plausibility. If you ask a child to do a mathematical problem, it'll make the sort of errors that a LLM will make. And so we need to be really careful here, because I do think, like, sometimes we think of ourselves, oh, I wouldn't make that kind of mistake. We make that kind of mistake all the time. And actually, bullshitting might be a fundamental part of human intelligence, using language to sort of extend ourselves beyond what we know. So I want to be careful here. I mean, sometimes it can produce a good paper, and sometimes it can produce a really bad paper. And I think we need to be aware of that. But I don't think we can just dismiss it as simulation. I mean, it is simulation, but what's it simulating? And to some degree, it might be simulating aspects of our own intelligence which we don't want to admit are there. Right? And so I want to be careful about that. So I think we need to be careful about that. And it's all part of, but I do think the problem is that it can also, because of that, seem better at things and give us misperceptions of things, just like we do with ourselves when we get into information bubbles and all the kind of stuff that happens that we're all too familiar with today.
All right, we're going to move on. Thank you. Let's address some moral issues that emerge here. To what extent should we trust AI systems? Who or what is culpable when these systems go wrong? We're all looking to the moral philosopher.
Morally speaking, if an knee-jerk response right now.
Yeah.
Morally speaking, if I was to go to AI for advice on how to act in response to a morally questionable situation, and I acted on the advice of AI, I acted. I am responsible, even if it's the case that the idea did not come from me, but I made the choice. I think it's really tricky in this respect. Can we trust AI? One of the earlier questions I didn't even respond to, because my answer would have been I don't know. In terms of does AI actually understand, or does it just simulate language? I see AI as seeing the patterns in what we say and responding back with patterns that align with the patterns we gave it. And so the absence of agency in AI, to me, makes me think who or what is culpable when these systems go wrong is it's the person who's choosing to act on them.
I mean, if I gave you advice and you acted on my very bad advice, it would still be sort of, would you think in that case that you would still be the morally culpable? So I agree, yeah. So I think that's interesting to think about in the parallel case, and maybe I'm a bullshitter, right? And I'm giving her, to use the term, and I'm just sort of saying whatever I think you want to hear, or like ChatGPT is the world's best cheerleader. I agree, and I was just sort of trying to tie it up in my mind as you said that. I think I would agree not doing ethics at all. My knee-jerk reaction would be, it's on you, so to speak. yeah,
I-
the morally culpable.
Yeah, I have a very strict view of accountability, but also it's the case that I want to distinguish between accountability and reflections of character. Because I could just be like really stupid and be like, oh, okay, whatever AI says is right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And that's not necessarily a reflection of me being a bad person, but I am still accountable.
I also think it's important not just to think about accountability, which is obviously an individual question. And so we immediately think, is it the CEO, or, you know, because we're looking for a person to be, and also, but to think about the way that the introduction of these technologies sort of changes the moral topography of our lives. You know, think about the internet and think about the print, you know, this is a place where the printing press does become clear. The moral topography of our lives changes when there is when you can write for the world as opposed to for the person who receives your letter. I've been thinking about this in terms of automobiles, you know, because I was reading about in the 1920s, they almost banned automobiles in most major cities in the United States until a coordinated advertising campaign came out to convince people that jaywalking was bad. That is to say that the roads are not for pedestrians. And so once we reconceptualized the nature of a road so that roads are for cars, then the moral topography of our lives changed. Because all of a sudden, if you're wandering around in the middle of a road, you're doing wrong. And yes, they shouldn't hit you. You know, we all agree with that. But the moral stakes are very different than if it's obvious that we all belong in the road and cars therefore have to drive really slowly to miss all the people. And so I think that something similar is happening with AI systems, is that the way that information is available to us and the way that bits of language out on the internet are available to us is changing very rapidly. And so thinking about, and this also in connection with our discussion of the previous one, thinking about how people are going to become subjects in a context where, I mean, when I was younger, Google searches were relatively reliable. You know, nowadays, the things you get at the top are some of the least reliable things, and you have to, you know, so it might actually be for the better that people have to work harder to figure out the answers to their questions than you had to when there were more efficient search mechanisms. But anyway, I think that when we're thinking about sort of the ethics of AI, thinking about the way that it changes social relations and so makes it so that different kinds of ethical questions have to be raised is also important, as well as the traditional questions about individual accountability. Did that sound like an ethicist kind of thing?
I'm also not an ethicist, so I'm just not going to talk about the ethics side. But so I think one sort of like interesting instance of this question arises in sort of non-moral contexts. So like one use case for AI these days is increasingly sort of assisting scientific research, basic scientific research. And it seems like you can sort of ask, and so the sort of use case for this, just so everyone's on the same page, is, you know, the kind of project that maybe you would have had a grad student do over the course of a couple months is now the sort of thing that you can sort of code up a team of AI agents to do in kind of a weekend. That's the typical use case. And this works particularly well in like data-intensive sciences, so things like astrophysics, astronomy, and parts of like computational biology. So I think there's like interesting questions about trust here too, because, you know, on the one hand, this can produce sort of useful scientific research. And so there's a question of like, you know, if it's on roughly the sort of par that you would get from a competent grad student after a fair bit of training, you know, should we be holding the AI to a higher standard than we would for, you know, a human doing this sort of research? And so I think there's a worry about like, having different kinds of standards in contexts where maybe they're not appropriate, or maybe, you know, we should just use the human standard for the AI, and if it, you know, has a good track record of producing reliable research, maybe in that context we can trust it. I think there's still like a tricky question about like culpability, like if, you know, the AI falsified some research or something like that, in that case, maybe it goes to the PI or whoever. But at least in this case, I would worry about having too high a standard with AI and sort of out of whack with the human case.
I also am not an ethicist, but I think we really need to worry about this question, and it's really pressing because AI is being used for targeting in warfare at this moment in Ukraine and in Iran. And there are real questions about who's culpable when things go wrong, when the targeting is misplaced. AI targeting potentially could be more reliable, but then when mistakes are made, we really need to figure out the issue of culpability, and we need to worry about handing responsibility over to the AI, because I think a lot of people will be tempted to use AI as a means of getting out of culpability. And so this is a really pressing issue. I don't have an answer for it, but I really think we need to worry about that.
I fully agree with Guy. In fact, you read my mind. I've published a couple books on ethics, and I teach military ethics, and targeting is clearly one place. In fact, I think you could have the general principle. You just don't want to use AI to make moral and political, and I would say aesthetic decisions either. You might look at some recommendations or something like that, but they're in principle not capable of making those. But more than that, probably, yeah, I mean, well, I don't know what the outcomes would be. That's an empirical question, but I think in principle, they're not to be trusted. When you see the word trust, though, it does suggest that maybe there's deception or something, but I suppose there could be other reasons, too, besides lack of trust for not using them. I think it depends. In order to maintain our moral integrity, we can't farm this out. We can farm out mechanical tasks. We can farm out calculations, and just as we do calculators right now, and all kinds of, I use a little electronic gizmo to look at the air pressure in my tires, fine. But to make moral, aesthetic, political judgments, I think that has to be out. Legal, my goodness, how did I forget? It's really a worrisome thing, the thought that AIs could be determining how liberty and property is distributed in legal contexts. Not a good idea, I think.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our next question, actually our 8th question. I think the next one, yeah, there we go. Do you think AI is shaping, reshaping, perhaps even stunting students' moral development?
Yes.
That was easy. Anyone?
I mean, I kind of agree with something Guy said earlier, is that clearly we're eggheads and we read a lot and we've read a lot of books. I mean, I feel like art, literature, reading enrich one's moral life. I kind of am sympathetic. There was a philosopher, Richard Rorty, who thought that maybe literature, in fact, is the best way to conduct moral inquiry. Well, we've already seen that students no longer read. I mean, the processes that have been de-skilling and de-critical thinking and deactivating our children in so many ways are in place, but this, I think, will accelerate it. What students often do now is they get summaries. They get the AI to do summaries of the readings, and if moral development is connected to the literary, to life, and it's not entirely, I don't think it is entirely, but that's a worrisome thing to me. I think people will be more and more cartoonish. Look at the way our political discourse goes on now. It sounds like a bunch of 8th graders are discussing the war in Iran and that sort of thing. It's flat, it's childish, it's without nuance.
5th graders.
It's without the kinds of things that come with reading and the sophistication that follows from it. And I think this will accelerate that process.
Anyone else?
So I might be putting a bit of a target on my back with what I'm about to say. So I think sort of notwithstanding all the concerns that we've raised so far, one thing kind of for us maybe as educators to think about is whether there are opportunities to use these tools to sort of prevent stunted moral growth. So just to sort of give an example of how this might go, a colleague of mine at the Cincinnati Ethics Center is thinking and developing sort of a version of ChatGPT, if you like, that's explicitly designed to get users to engage in proper sort of moral reasoning. And so the way that it sort of goes is it'll prompt you with like an ethical sort of problem or dilemma, and it'll ask you for your opinion on it. And once it sort of figures out your angle, it explicitly tries to push you in the opposite direction. So it sort of forces you to practice articulating reasons. And then it gives you a little summary of sort of like, here's how you're thinking about this problem, here's another way you can think about it. I think this is sort of extremely early days, and we don't really have a good sense of whether, like, the empirical question of whether this actually will improve, like, moral and critical reasoning. But I think we also don't want to like fall too quickly into like sort of dismissing these out of hand as potentially useful tools. Okay, hopefully that doesn't put too much of a target on me.
Should we move on? Yeah.
I'm at a little bit of a loss to this question because I think there's so easy in philosophy of technology to go into moral panic, particularly if you're of a generation that is removed from the introduction of a technology. And so I think I've had to do things in response to teaching, like Blue Book exams and other ways of making sure that students do the reading. And let's be clear, I've only taught one class where all the students did all the reading, and that was in maximum security prison. I was just teaching. But I have been heartened a little bit by seeing students become self-aware and know of the damages that are potentially arising. And in fact, when I teach philosophy of technology, one of the things I usually do is sort of have students initially talk about their relationship to technology. And invariably, the people that are working in technology say, I have no social media, I know it's horrible for me, and I want to get away from that. I know lots of young people who are very much aware of it and really want to do philosophy in a way that is personal and active and dynamic. And I've seen a kind of resurgence of interest in that in response. So I'm worried, but I'm also cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I agree with much of what you said. I found that, well, I was surprised and heartened in the past year when I've had conversations in my intro to philosophy of cog sci class about how much students are expressing worries about AI and about disconnection. If you ask in my honors class, if you say, well, here's a box, you can chuck your phone in there. If you want to chuck it in there, I'm not requiring that you do this. Most of them will do it. So I mean, in some ways, I want to say I don't know as the answer to that question, because I don't really know, the connections between, moral development and these other issues. But I can attest to the fact that I've seen some of the same things in the classroom.
I just one thing I wanted to add there, though, is my students are also express the attitudes that I applaud. But then, like, I had a student who I love, who I've had in several classes, who has expressed those attitudes over the years. And in an early essay this semester, she turned in something that was really clearly AI. And so I asked her about it, and she said, I just ran out of time. And that's a lever that is, and so this is why I like the idea, like, it makes sense to me that this student would be the sort of person who, if you had said, if I had a way of removing AI as a possibility for her, she would have taken it. But she knew where it was, she knew how to use it, and she ran out of time. Yep. And this is one of the things I've been thinking about when I'm thinking about the way it changes sort of moral topography, like the choices that are available, which we don't even realize, or I don't even realize, because I just get weirded out whenever I'm suggested something that I realize is AI. Like, our students aren't like that. You guys aren't like that. And so that's, the choices that are available to people are very different, and in ways that also serve as cautionary notes, not just as optimistic.
I mean, it's when they run up against other things, like, I'm taking 21 credit hours. Why are you doing that? Because I need to get out, and these kinds of financial, like I've seen and heard a lot of that as well, and I've had exactly that thing happen this year as well. So it's tricky.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and shift to education? Do you think colleges and universities are moving too quickly to embrace AI? Should there be more scrutiny of these systems at the college level?
Hello. So I don't even know where to begin with this one. I will say I think that institutions of higher education have a responsibility to educate students about AI and its responsible use. I do not know what that looks like. I think about this in terms of the cell phone and social media, and there was no discipline or area in life that really had any responsibility to educate people about, you know, using cell phones in these different places or what you post on social media. Like there was never any education about that. And the way I see it is that AI is affecting education and higher education. So it seems like, okay, well, this is a great opportunity to help educate, you know, people now, educate our future children about its implications. Because we, you know, I'm glad I didn't have a cell phone when I was an undergraduate in college. Oh my goodness. You know, like just thinking about all these different things, and it just seems that, you know, maybe we do have a special, you know, obligation to the future.
On the other hand, when I think about this question, I don't think about it primarily from the educational mission of the university. I think of it primarily from the standpoint, very similar to the standpoint of the way in which our children have iPads and Chromebooks in elementary school, and the way in which lots and lots of money is pushing people to, I mean, so the word embrace is the one that jumps out at me in this question, because that is the 2 years ago when these questions were first arising, my university anyway was very concerned to emphasize the way that AI could be used for cheating and to talk about issues having to do with academic integrity and LLMs. Now there are task forces across the university to figure out how to integrate AI tools into our teaching, and every department is going to, within 2 years, have a plan for integrating artificial technologies into their major curriculum. And I don't understand why that switch happened, except that I think that there's a lot of money behind it. And that's something that really disturbs me. So in that sense, I think it's really, it looks to me on the ground at a university as if colleges and universities are moving far too quickly to embrace AI, which is different from whether they're moving too quickly to think about AI. Thinking about things is what we do, but it's the embrace that concerns me.
May I say this? This might even be my question rewritten up here, but it's one of the things that really concerns me. And it was one thing that was a sort of light bulb moment for me to see this happen, because there's always things coming along, there's always changes being happen, but the alacrity, the velocity, the celerity with which this came charging down upon us, do you think it came from the faculty? It came from years of educational study about what was best for our students to learn? No, this came from the oligarchs. This came from Elon Musk, this came from Sam Altman, and this came from this mythology. I actually think also there's a philosophical, it comes from the nihilism that's deep in our culture. There is this thing that goes way back into early modernity with Descartes and Bacon about how technology is going to save us. It's just another golden calf. It won't save us. And so part of the, I think the motive for this velocity has been the emptiness of our lives and this false belief that technology will fill that emptiness. But it's also, it's because these oligarchs have decided for us that this is the way it will be for us. And that on itself is grounds for resistance. And I know that, but the Dean Bowling was here anyway, if she still is. I know you get a lot of pressure to bring this in, to do this nonsense, like integrate. We're doing the opposite. We're trying to figure out how to keep it out of our classrooms, at least in philosophy at Transylvania. Who told us, too, that we need this for employment? Is there any empirical studies that's proving that? It may be damaging for people's employment. I mean, I have a cousin who's an engineer, thinks that candidates for jobs in his firm, it's a negative for them because they don't think the young candidate knows how to do it on their own. I mean, so beware of this being pushed on us, and ask yourself, okay, why is it being pushed on us? Who's making this money? So, trillions of dollars have appeared when they've told us we can't have like universal health care. Well, how is that possible, right? At a time when we need to be like reducing our carbon footprint, they're building gargantuan 25%. I've seen this in several sources, reliable ones. 25% of Virginia's electricity goes to AI now. it's just suicidal, it's genocidal, it's nihilistic. So I think this is really an important thing to resist, the velocity of this, and slow down. There may be positive things for us, but this, sorry for the rant, but this is something that really concerns me. So, yeah, thank you.
I'm going to jump in here. We have a little less than 20 minutes left, so I'd like to stop here, if we could, and turn it over to audience questions. So, so we're going to grab maybe 1 or 2 microphones here, if we could. And the only thing I ask is that you please try to keep your questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And please try to keep your questions rather short so we can get as many questions in as possible. So I see a question over here.
We've talked about AI almost.
Yeah, the mic's off. Sorry.
You hear me now? There we go. We've talked about AI almost in a vacuum and really haven't touched the people that are controlling these technologies. And I am personally convinced they're insane. They do not care about the ethical questions that are involved. And so the question is, what do we do about that, especially in the face of political malpractice by our leadership?
So I don't know anything about how to answer your question, but I do want to say one thing about what they do and don't care about, because long-termist utilitarian consequentialism is something that I think some of these people do genuinely believe, but when you spell it out in the way in which some of them believe it, it becomes really, really distressing. Because if you believe that there is a coming apocalypse, and it's either going to be an extinction level or a near extinction level event, then it doesn't matter how 95% of the population lives, because all we need to do is make sure that not everybody dies. And if that's your only concern, then you get a lot of the behavior you're getting. And so it could be that there are actual quote-unquote principles at work here. It might not just be fecklessness, although it could also be that. I mean, this could just be a convenient cover for pure greed.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? There's a question back here, Eleanor, if you... Oh, I'm sorry, were you going to respond? Go ahead, sorry, Andre.
Is this one? There we go. So one sort of bit of rhetoric that sometimes comes out of, like I think sort of Sam Altman has said things like this, is that there's sort of conceiving of intelligence, as it were, as a resource, and a resource that can be sort of packaged and sold. But you might think sort of, one thing we do with other kinds of resources is, figure out democratic mechanisms for distributing them fairly. And so, one way to react to this situation is to start thinking about what sort of that democratic solution might look like. I have no idea what that looks like in detail, but it strikes me, if we sort of take them at face value and think of intelligence as a resource in the same way that we might think of like, water or electricity as resources, then we need to think about sort of equitable ways to distribute them through democratic mechanisms.
I think there was a question back here, Dr. O'Callaghan.
Can we start here?
What's that?
Can we start here? Dr. Reynolds.
Oh, okay, yeah, Dr. Reynolds, please.
Jonathan Reynolds from the Department of History here. I've got I think 72 questions, but I'll try and boil this down as much as possible. First, I want to address the question about whether or not AI is a good thing in education. And going back to what one of the things Peter said is, I'm terrified by the fact that people desire efficiency so much, often university administrators. But real education is not efficient. And trying to find your way through things and not finding the information right away is one of the best things I think you can have in an education. If I had AI and if the archives I had worked with as a graduate student in Nigeria had been all in a database, I would have gone straight to the documents I needed. But I came out of that research knowing so much more about Nigerian history because I had to read 5,000 different documents to find the 200 documents that were really relevant to the dissertation I was trying to write. And so I don't want things to lead my students exactly to the source they need right away. I want them to go digging through it. I want them wandering through libraries trying to find what's there. But following up on that, I love the question about, what's the difference between human intelligence and AI intelligence? And I want to stress that based on over 3 decades of teaching, every single human being is intelligent in a different way. I mean, I really do believe that every single human brain is wired in a unique way. And so I think when we hand over to artificial intelligence, and how many artificial intelligences are we going to have? We talk about ChatGPT, we talk about Claude, whatever. Are we going to have a dozen? Are we going to have 2 dozen? Are we boiling down intelligence to just a few versions instead of having 8 billion plus versions of intelligence? And the last spinoff of this too, and this is a question, so it's actually a useful question. Do different LLM models think differently in different languages?
Oh.
Because we've moved into a period now where English is like the global lingua franca, especially for computer science and such as this. So we're training the vast majority of these things using English and mostly English language sources. Would ChatGPT come up with different responses in Haitian Creole, if that's the language that it's using, or in West African Pidgin? And Peter mentioned, some of you saw me get excited when he mentioned pictographic scripts. The Chinese language is built around characters, and each character can have 50, 60, 70 different meanings. So is an LLM working in Mandarin Chinese aware that the words influence each other, all the different words that are built on the radical for tree? Is it aware that those words have a sort of poetic connection between themselves? So I'll stop there.
The short answer is yes, that it would think differently because it's working on statistical properties and interrelationships between the words, and they're going to be different. It may not be as neat and tidy as we would like, but undoubtedly the statistical relationships between the word tokens would be different, and that would lead to different behavior. Of course, you need a lot of Haitian Creole. You don't just need a little bit because of the dependence on data. So unquestionably, the use of a different language and the data associated with it would create a different behaving LLM. Also, when we interact with LLMs, they're tuned and they're products, and so they are different, right? Claude doesn't act the same way ChatGPT acts, and et cetera. So I do think there are important differences here.
Anyone else? Okay. No? All right, we've got a question back here. Dr. O'Callaghan? Oh, we got to turn the mic on.
Hello. Okay, great. Actually, I can kind of answer that question. LLMs, in terms of generative AI, are actually more efficient in Mandarin. They've been trained on both classical Mandarin and English. And using Mandarin actually uses fewer tokens, so it's less harmful to the environment, it's cheaper, it uses about 30 to 40% less. And so one of the things that's quite efficient is to write your prompt in English, then ask it to be translated by Google Translate into Mandarin, put it in, get the results, then have the results translated back into English. And just so you know, I'm in the English department. I teach historical linguistics. So I'm very aware of that. But for example, you can't get it to work in Nepalese because it hasn't been trained on it. I also wanted to say that in terms of the presentation, I can give you a negative example of the printing press. When it first came out, which was before the Bible was available in vernacular. It was in Latin. The church greatly feared it was going to be the end of Christianity because people would have a Bible in their hand and they wouldn't go to church anymore. Now, that proved not to be true, but we could argue that in standardizing English through the printing press, what we have done is devalued accent and dialect variation, particularly regionally and in Britain in terms of social class, okay?
That's excellent. That's
And
excellent.
so what I'm going to tell you, your question about language, does AI understand language, for me is not the question. Someone there talked about turning the questions the other way around. What concerns me is that AI is going to change how we understand language, that instead of standard English being either before World War II, whether we like it or not, British colonial, like British Commonwealth English, and then after World War II, American English, it is now going to be AI English, and I suspect that's going to be the same true for Mandarin. It's going to be AI Mandarin. And that actually, for me, is like looking at it as like, that makes me actually quite uncomfortable. I'm not sure it's a philosophical question as much for me as a linguistic question. But I would also add your question about the point about the fact that this is not, AI in the classroom is not coming from the faculty up, it's being driven down. I'd be interested where in your university you think it's coming from, because studies are showing that these AI companies have realized that they need to reach out to centers of teaching and learning as a way to get into the classroom. And I wondered
Good question.
if that was something you had seen.
I will ask them. I will say that, like so many things, we returned in the fall to discover that the university had purchased for $120,000 a ChatGPT subscription for, but that just appeared, and I don't know who that was from, though. I will check it out. I thought of another downside, by the way, with printing, and it was memory. I think there's evidence. I mean, Wycliffe was, copying the Bible in English before, and there were Vulgates, of course, but yeah, I think there's evidence to show that written word had negatively affected memory, that people used to have better memories beforehand. And it's something Plato worried about. But yeah, there's always ups and downs to these technologies, but we have to sort of still make the best judgments we can about it.
So can I?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I was thinking about this in connection with the French Creole question earlier, because the choice of a Creole was, I thought, was really telling. And I was thinking about whether, and this is an empirical question that I don't know, but how Pidgins and Creoles and the dynamics of language would be affected by and interact with the way in which, because those are primarily formed via, my understanding anyways, they're primarily formed in intersubjective contexts, in publics, not, and there are, of course, there are internet dialects as well, but I don't know, but I'm not, and not being a linguist, I haven't studied these things, but I'm curious as to how the dynamics of, I was already thinking about how the dynamics of language would be affected by these standardizations, and then the suggestion that we could have an AI English become the lingua franca at least in the European worlds was a distressing sort of echo of that. So I wanted to.
Well, I think we're at the end here, so let's take a moment to thank our panelists. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Dean Bowling once again, the chair of our department, Yao Frimpong Mansao, Sydney Malatesta, I don't know if you're still here, in the dean's office, and Ren Spiegelmeyer and Alador, I don't know, Alador over there, Alador Morgan, my two student workers. I couldn't have done this without your help, so thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for coming out. I appreciate you coming out. If you are available, right after this is the second edition of the Born Before AI series, so if you can, stick around. Thank you very much.